This episode is brought to you by Redfin. You're listening to a podcast, which means you're probably multitasking. Maybe even scrolling home listings on Redfin, saving homes without expecting to get them. But Redfin isn't just built for endless browsing. It's built to help you find and own a home. With agents who close twice as many deals, when you find the one, you've got a real shot at getting it. Get started at redfin.com. Own the dream.
Marvel Television's Wonder Man, an 8-episode series, now streaming on Disney+.
A superhero remake, not exactly what we'd expect from an Oscar-winning director.
Action! Simon Williams, audition for Wonder Man.
I'm gonna need you to sign this, assuming you don't have superpowers.
I'll never work again if anyone found out.
My lips are sealed.
Marvel Television's Wonder Man. All 8 episodes now streaming, only on Disney+.
Good evening, everyone. Once again, it's Jay Scott. This is The Hook Rocks, the Ultimate Rock Community Podcast. Hope everyone's having a good day. Killer hornets are amongst us, supposedly. I don't know, I'm just kidding. But apparently they were spotted out like in Canada and like the state of Washington. And man, do they look fierce. They look crazy. They look like jerks, if I had to say so. The stinger on that thing itself is enough to scare a village. It's just unbelievable. Not only do we have the pandemic, now we've got these hornets that are, and at least in some part of the United States, I may be at the point where I may just never leave the house again, but we will see what happens with that. Hope you're staying healthy. Hope you're staying busy. Hope you're staying social. We have another episode, a really interesting episode that I've been wanting to do here for a bit. And I'd like to welcome in Mark from playlisterblog.com. You can find him on Twitter at playlisterblog. A really unique concept, a really unique idea about the days of yesterday with playlists and mixtapes and what they meant to you and how they create a memory, or how they were like your partner on a road trip. You put the burn CD in the car, or you put the mixtape in the car, and you go on your 2-3 hour road trip, or longer in some cases, and you listen to the tunes that you set up for that trip. It was a whole thought process back in the day, and it really connected with me because I was one of those kids and one of those people that used to do that. What's going on, Mark? How are you?
I'm doing good. How about yourself?
Doing as good as can be. You and I are both in Illinois, so we're kind of, sharing the same type of reality. And, before we got on the call, we had a, brief chat about just the differences and just, what life is like right now. But, yeah, good as can be, I guess.
Yeah. I just wish the weather was a little bit more consistent right now.
Yeah, that's the crazy thing, too. It's like we'll have 2 days in the 60s and then 2 days in the mid-40s to low 50s. And then, tomorrow's going to be back up to 60. So is Thursday, and then it drops back down to the mid-40s again. It's just a roller coaster between April and now the beginning of May.
Yeah.
Well, getting into this, we always start with the same question every time we have a first-time guest on the show. And that is the essence of the Hook Rocks, which is like every rock song has a hook that sucks you in. Every rock band has a moment, whether it's a song, an album, a band, or performance that hooked you on rock and roll. What was it for you?
I was born in the early 80s. I have an older sister and a younger brother. I don't know when to start, but our cousins were older than us, so they babysat us. Our dad would drop us off in the morning at their house, and they'd watch us. And they were, my oldest was probably a teenager. So, of course, what's on TV? MTV. all I can think about and remember was, us, being, I don't know, 6, 7 years old, watching MTV, seeing those great old animations they'd have, showing MTV and all the videos. But I think here it's, at least with the rock and roll, is gotta be Guns N' Roses and Welcome to the Jungle. I just remember the start of the song, 5, 6, 7 years old. It's just something that stands out to you. From there, I know my cousin Mel was a big Bon Jovi fan. And so, of course, we listened to that. My other cousin Kim, I remember when she was the younger one, and she started babysitting for us. She had a VW Beetle convertible. I remember riding around one day, and she had some Black Sabbath on tape deck. And so she popped it in, and we thought it was the coolest thing, just riding around, 4 of us, and just playing Black Sabbath, running errands. So I'd say that's kind of where it started for me.
Yeah, that's very similar to, my journey, into rock and roll. I had an older brother who was 4 years older than me, who introduced me to Journey and who introduced me to, the Van Halen, and, whatever he brought home, I would eventually get around to listening to it, whether he knew it or not. And then I had an older cousin that later on introduced me to Led Zeppelin. There were older kids in the neighborhood where I heard Iron Maiden, or I heard Judas Priest or Dio or whatever it was. And then, of course, the MTV influence was huge as well. Whether it was with Kiss when they took the makeup off. And I remember when that Welcome to the Jungle video first came out. I remember when it world premiered on Headbangers Ball and how it fell flat when they first released it. Like, it just didn't do anything. It didn't resonate with anybody. It didn't move anything. It didn't move any record sales for them. And then they redid it maybe like 8 months later, 7, 8 months later, I want to say. Maybe shorter. Everything's kind of fuzzy now as you get older. And then it just exploded. It just became this huge, gigantic hit, and the rest is history for Guns N' Roses. When did the mixtape, the act of putting together music for either your friends or for yourself, come into play for you?
So around the same time, I think that's something that was passed down from my cousins to myself and my siblings as well, because we would be riding around, running errands while they're babysitting us. They'd pop in a tape. I know, at least for making it for ourselves at home, my brother and I shared a room, but we didn't have a stereo at all. Eventually, my sister got one. But what we did have prior was what was called a My First Sony. And I have this in one of my early blog posts. And you can see a picture of it, but it's, I don't know, maybe 12-inch tall, and it's got a speaker and a tape deck. It's this bright red, yellow, and blue device meant for kids. But what it had was a microphone. We didn't have any money. We were, under 10 years old or, whatever. So what we do is, if we did have a blank tape, record off the radio if we knew one of our favorite songs was going to start. And so we'd have a recording of that song. And then also, we used to buy a lot of cassette singles. I don't know why, but I think that's just what we did. They were cheaper, I think. When it came around to it, we'd take songs we recorded off the radio, the cassette singles, and when my sister finally had that, dual cassette stereo, we could then, start making mixtapes. I think that lasted for a while. When I turned 16, CDs had already taken over. So, there really wasn't anything for mixtapes. My first car did have a tape deck for a few months before I had it taken out for a CD player. I think I made a mix or two then just to have something to listen to outside of the radio. And then finally, by the senior year of high school, right as I was graduating, one of my friends got a CD burner. And so, I know I made a couple mixes with him, and then probably not for another year later, which I think would have been around 2002, did, I have the ability to make a burn CD.
Well, that was, the mixtape era, before we get into burning CDs or burning music on one of those, recordable CDs or whatever, you're able to burn it on them, because that didn't exist at first either. That came later after CDs came out. But I remember mixtapes, the age of the mixtape. was essentially for you to share with your friends if they didn't have the album, or if they wanted to check it out, you know, where it was the original file sharing, if you will, of that era. It was a way to, hey, I got this new Megadeth album, or I got this new Motley Crue album. Check it out. I just, record the new Motley Crue album on and you give your friend a Memorex tape or TDK, blank tape, or whatever the brand was.
Yeah.
And then your friend would come back to school either the next day or the following day after that, and they'd have the new Motley Crue tape for you. It was a way to listen to music that maybe you were unsure of before you bought the album, because I don't remember the mixtape ever affecting people from buying something. I think what it was, at least in my experience, was people sharing music, and then if they liked it, they would go out and buy the album because they wanted the cover art, they wanted the experience of, having it on display at their house or wherever it was. So I think there was that element to it. Now, the mixtape was always used in my memory as a way of conveying your feelings for someone you had a crush on, or someone you liked, or someone you were dating. You'd put together these songs that, that meant things to you to show how deep you were, and to show how much, you admired her or him or whomever. And I just remember having to put a lot of thought into making one of those tapes.
It's funny you bring that up. That's actually the blog post I'm writing right now, is my guide. You're making a mixtape for someone else. Yeah, I remember, at least in like middle school for me, that's when a lot of us got into like BMG and Columbia House and the CD and tape clubs. And, you get a friend to sign up, you get extra free ones or whatever. If you weren't able to get that one CD, you were able to get your friend to at least, throw it on a tape for you. With what you were saying, it was a way to, if you weren't able to get, whatever CD or cassette at the time, you could always get your friend to at least record it one for you. And I remember, actually one of my good friends, it was probably 7th or 8th grade, and it was just some music, had quite a bit of some probably early punk, or not early punk, early to mid 90s, and it's some stuff I hadn't heard before. Also, I grew up in the country, central Illinois. Our radio stations were pop, country, and mainstream rock. Because we only had those types of influences, and if you had MTV, you were exposed to some things, but some things you just, didn't get. So when my friend gave me this tape, there's a whole bunch of stuff I'd never heard of. Some I liked, some I didn't, but it was just, great to get.
It was, like I said, there were two types of tapes that you'd make for your friends. You'd do like the thoughtless tape, I would call it, where your friend would say, hey, can you get the new Guns N' Roses for me on this blank tape? Or can you do the new Def Leppard, or whoever the band was? Or if it was a band that you were unsure of, like a Danger, or like a Sabotage, or whatever it was, you'd put it on the tape and they would go listen to it, and then if they liked it, they go buy it. But then there was the thought process behind the mixtape. There was the sequencing, which was very important to a mixtape. Like what song do you want to intro with, and then where do you want the end to be, or what song do you want to finish? Because it was like one giant thought you were giving someone. You were giving someone like a peek into your mind, and how you wanted to convey that was what songs you put on that tape.
Oh yeah, incredibly important thing is the sequence of the songs. Like you said, if you're making one just for a friend, or if you're making it for someone maybe that you're, romantic with or hope to be romantic with, you do have to understand that person and the songs that you're putting on there. That sequence of them is so important. You just, you have to kick it off, loud, or at least with a purpose. So you kind of get your foot in the door and get, them a little bit, excited about what's coming next. For me, I usually kind of start it big, kind of either bring it up a notch and then step down a little bit, and then maybe go soft for a little bit, then ramp it back up. And then you always kind of got to finish big as well.
That was very important, right? I mean, you used to think that the mixtape was so important to the relationship, and maybe it was. I don't remember, and because it's been so long, I don't remember if it was the end all be all. But we had that thought in our heads that basically said, to ourselves, well, this is going to make the difference. This is going to make her like me more. Or if it was a girl, this is going to get his attention. And, I got a lot of mixtapes and I made a lot of mixtapes, and I don't know. I just think it was the thought process that you have in your head when you're a teenager, that you want to show people what important songs are in your life, or what these songs mean to you, or how they mean, or how they correlate to me thinking of that person, or you thinking of that person. And I guess it was an easy way to communicate feelings. You know what I mean? It was, if you were not good at communicating, the mixtape was like the perfect way to get your thought across, or get your point across. Did a mixtape ever blow up in your face?
I don't think so. I'm trying to, now again, if we were still doing mixtapes, it would have been like middle school, because, we kind of turned over to CDs pretty quickly. I don't think so. And I was thinking about this the other day, which ones have I made for people? Was there one to be romantic with, or, was romantic with? And I can only think of a couple, and those were CDs. And none of them, blew up in my face. I just cannot remember a single one from like junior high or high school, though.
Yeah, I think there was one when I was in junior high, before I realized the sexual innuendos of, some of the songs that they were singing about, for instance, I remember putting Love Gun on a mixtape, the song by Kiss. And, I thought it was the equivalent to, what's the guy with the arrow on Valentine's Day?
Cupid?
Yeah, I thought it was the equivalent to Cupid, shooting the arrow. So it was Love Gun. So, that was like the first song. And I guess the mother got wind of it or whatever and called my mother. And my mother was like, "What are you doing?" And I had to explain to her what my thought process was. And then I think that was the gateway. I think that was the gateway to the birds and the bees conversation with my parents.
Oh.
I think my intention of making a mixtape for this girl I had a crush on turned into, how women get pregnant and, all this stuff. And it was a complete nightmare for me. It was like, so I remember not listening to Love Gun for about a year or two, just because, I thought it was, because you're what, I think 13 years, I was 13 years old at the time. And, I was raised, in a Catholic school, so I didn't really, have the exposure to, that kind of things that maybe some other kids had at that age. And I was really kind of innocent, even though I was a little bit of a troublemaker. And, now when I listen to Love Gun, I just kind of laugh every time I hear it.
That's great. Unintended consequences.
Yes. That just steamrolled into other consequences. First there was the call from the mother, then there was the sit down with the parents, and then it was just, I was scarred for a couple of years after that. But yeah, it was an interesting time because, you had to have the dual cassette player for the boombox, one that played, one that record. You had to have the good quality tapes, so you didn't want to mess it up or have it sound muffled or whatever. But like I said, it was a good way to communicate your feelings to someone that you had feelings for. It's very difficult. Now they have, Snapchat videos or Facebook Live videos of, signs that say, "Will you date me?" and all that stuff. That never happened when we were growing up. It was, you had to get man enough to approach a girl and a really good way to do that in a soft way was, hey, these are these songs, and every time I hear these songs, I think about you. Check them out, and then you kind of give it to her, then you just kind of hold your fingers and hold your breath for like a day or two until she listened to it.
Yeah. You had to, have the guts to either hand it to them in person or, have a friend deliver it or sneak it into their locker or somewhere else they would find it, and if you did that, you had to have a note with it.
Right.
So it was, it's a lot different.
The note was like the Happy Meal of mixtapes. It came with like two things, right? It came,
right.
not it wasn't just a mixtape with songs. It was a letter about the songs and about the tape that you took the time to record. I guess the other big question was, would you fill both sides or would it just be one side? Or would you talk in between songs? I know there was cases where someone would narrate between the songs and connect them to one each other and how it related to that person, which is, borderline maybe creepy depending on how you do it. But I remember those happening too as well.
Yeah, I definitely no narration. I would fill both sides just because that person's going to get to the end of side one and flip it over. If there's nothing there, it's kind of empty. And that's another, technical aspect is you had to know where you were on that first side so that you didn't, start recording a song and they get cut off, halfway through. Yeah, I think you have to have both sides filled.
You're right, because if you did a 90-minute tape, you'd have 45 minutes on one side, 45 minutes on the other. And the worst would be if you developed a sequencing and the tape would run out and the last song, wouldn't finish, because then it would screw up your sequencing. It would screw up your thought process. So that was, you're right, very important to how it was laid out and how you had to know if you had a 60-minute tape, 30 on one side, 30 on the other. It was a big to-do.
Yeah. And the last song is going to be important because that's the last thing they're going to hear.
Right. Did you ever do a 120-minute tape? Because that's
I don't think we ever had them. I remember this. I think the 75 and the 90.
Okay. Yeah, I remember using either 60 or 90 minutes.
A couple of years ago, I think my mom cleaned out my brother and I's old room, and she must have gotten rid of all the tapes we had because we still had a stack of the cassette singles and then some free demos they used to give out at Ozfest, and then I think a couple of the mixes too. We never took them, so I think she just got rid of them. And so I have like no way of knowing exactly what I had.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of tapes that I wish I still had that I don't have anymore. Just because it jogs, the memory bank, and it helps you connect with things that maybe, you had forgotten about. And music has a very powerful tool in memory. And having those mixtapes, David Lee Roth said a really interesting thing, about 7-8 years ago, about listening to music when it first comes out and loving a song and listening to it over and over and over again, because that song has the ability to be a time machine. And if you listen to it, if you over listen to it, I don't even know if there's such a thing, you have the ability for that song to take you back to that time and to smell and feel those memories more so than without music, I think. Every time I hear certain songs, it immediately takes me back to being 10 years old or 14 years old or 16 or 18 in my early 20s. Music, more so than any other art form, at least for me, has a great ability.
That's actually why I started the blog. I don't know. I'm heading towards 40, I guess, and I'm just kind of, sometimes I reminisce and I'll throw on one of my old playlists from a Burn CD and listen to it, and I'll kind of just go back or I heard, a random song that I knew was on this one CD from 2004, and I just, remember, what was going on at that time. That's just why I kind of started the playlist, so I could both share the music from those CDs and eventually playlists and, what was going on in my life at the time. And it's really for me, but I kind of put it out there publicly just to put it out there.
Well, I find it very interesting because it really, when I started reading the blog and remembering those times of making mixtapes or burning CDs, which is where the evolution happened, right? Like there was a point where you stopped making the mixtapes and you started burning CDs, you started burning playlists. And at least for me, when I was able to burn a CD with music and create a playlist, and you had maybe 14 songs to 16 songs on a CD. For me, at least, I was older. I was out of high school when that happened. So those became kind of my road trip buddy. You know, like if I was going to visit my friend out in Maryland, or if I was going to visit my friend out in Michigan, or wherever I was going, I was really into doing road trips, by myself, going to Nashville or going to Pennsylvania or wherever I was driving, Iowa. And I would make sure I knew the time that it was going to take me to get there. And I would compile an assortment of discs with different songs to kind of lead me on my journey that I was about to take. And I love that because it just, because sometimes you hear a song differently than when you're in a car and you're on a road trip and you're driving through the country and you're seeing cool stuff. It changes the whole dynamic of the song than listening through headphones, staring at the ceiling, or reading liner notes.
Oh, definitely.
I remember doing a Michigan trip, and I had recently bought the Pete Yorn CD, Music for the Morning After. And I had made all these burn CDs, but I brought that one with me because I really hadn't dived into it yet because I just bought the record. And it was the first record I bought based on a sample that you could listen to at Tower Records. And it used to be where they'd have the discs that you could sample, and they'd play like 30 seconds of each song. And I bought it based on that. And I remember listening to that on the way up to Michigan. But then on the way back, I had burned all these Black Crowes CDs with different songs from the Crows. And I remember just re-listening to those songs and hearing them differently than I had before.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. One of my most recent posts goes over my spring break 2004, and I couldn't go anywhere really because I had to work. But I had like a day off. I decided to drive to Nashville to find Johnny Cash's grave. I'm pretty sure I had crafted the songs to go on the CD right before I left, or within a week or so before I left. And I made sure, a couple were just road trip songs or songs about traveling. Like it's got the Johnny Cash version of I've Been Everywhere, Arlo Guthrie's City of New Orleans, and a couple others. And it gives you that feeling when you're on the road and, you have those songs lined up and you're waiting for them to come on. And it is, like you said, just the perfect thing for a road trip.
When you're driving, right, you're concentrating on what's going on the road. You're trying to, enjoy the scenery at the same time. You can't always do both. And, when you're going to visit a friend and you've got your tunes with you and you've got, the playlist going, it's kind of a celebration of what you're doing. It's kind of, especially when I was doing the road trips, I was in my early 20s. I wasn't yet married. And, I had friends that had gone to school at different parts of the country or moved to different places. And it was just kind of a way to celebrate the independence that you were experiencing, especially, now that you were out of the house and now that you were kind of your own person, and having that celebration, and the music was there to help you just enjoy it more. It was definitely important. The music was always important on a road trip. It was very, very strategic too, is how you listen to it. You mean, okay, I'm going to listen to this on the way up there, on the way back. This is what I'm going to listen to. So it was just always, a constant theme whenever. And then sometimes you'd want to go on road trips just so you can make playlists.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, with a road trip, you don't know the radio stations in other areas of the country usually. And so you're either trying to flip through the dial, but if you have, your CDs ready to go, or nowadays, your phone to plug in, you just get it set and just cruise without having to worry about it.
Yeah, I think what is missing today, because I've gone through the evolution from mixtape to burn CD, now to having your phone play the music for you, streaming or set up a playlist in that way. Because I think there's less thought the way it's done now, because you really do have, endless time, right? Because I remember I did a road trip with my son several years ago, or 4 or 5 years ago, where we went to Iowa, to Colorado, down to the Four Corners, up through Utah, over to Yellowstone, to Mount Rushmore, to Minnesota, back to Illinois. It was like about a 10-day road trip. And I remember putting like 500 songs on this playlist. And my rule, too, on a road trip is you never skip a song. You never skip ahead. You got to play it through. And I just remember, though, having all these songs and just throwing a bunch on there. And the thought process, for me at least, was different than burning a CD or making a mixtape. How about for you?
I think it depends. And it depends on, if I'm aware that I'm going somewhere and, I want to make, something new, I'm going to take the time. One of my posts from February, I had to, it's, how I make a playlist is the name of the post. In February, I had to go to Indianapolis for a friend's bachelor party. I knew I was going to have 3 hours drive, but I still have a set of rules, or my philosophy I have for my playlist. I still try to keep them at about 80 minutes, which is what a burn CD used to be, just because I don't want an endless playlist, I guess. I want to have a set number of tracks that remind me of the experience. And so, because I knew I was going on a trip, I took the time prior to maybe 2 weeks or so and started crafting what I wanted to have on it. Now, other times, if I'm just, I'm going to go, I have to drive down to my mom's house or something that's 3 hours away, I might just have a large mix that I just hit, shuffle on for the trip, because it's kind of a routine trip. So for me, it depends.
Do you have any rules when you're doing a road trip, or you're driving somewhere, long distance? Like myself, there's no skipping of the song, got to play it through. I have those kind of weird, funky rules.
If it's one of the playlists I took the time to craft, I'm definitely not skipping anything. But if it's one where it's just, from a whole bunch of like favorite songs, if I feel like I've, heard it too much recently or something like that, then I'll skip. It's just that, and this is going to be kind of probably weird to people who aren't, I guess, into playlists that much, but I have, I was talking about my philosophy and just a canon of playlists, if you will, ones that I keep as like my official playlists, which, are the ones I can kind of look back on and tie those to a time in my life. And those are the ones I'll write about. Yeah. It just depends on what type of playlist it is.
Yeah. I think that's why there was a connection with burning CDs or making the mixtape, is because, you had to put, not that you don't put thought in with making a playlist, with iTunes or whatever with your phone. But, when you were going on a road trip and you brought 4, 5, 6 burn CDs with you, or 2 or 3, whatever the case was, you were creative enough to kind of sequence those songs together, and you kind of wanted to hear how it all played out, whereas, and it gave you incentive to not skip anything. I remember making tapes by one band and making it like an album. So if like Van Halen with David Lee Roth, has, what do they got, 6 albums, up until 1984, I would make one album with 12 songs, and that would be like my Van Halen album. So I would choose these songs to fit on this, this mixtape or this burn CD, and how they were sequenced together was very important. Or whether it was Guns N' Roses or, Pearl Jam or Soundgarden or any of those bands, it was just interesting. I always loved doing that, trying to find the songs that fit together, 12 songs that fit together from multiple albums.
Yeah, I like that idea because, with some bands, like, you get their greatest hits album, and it's really like some of the greatest hits and then some random tracks, but they're not always your favorite songs. So if you're able to craft a playlist of, your greatest hits for a band, it's a great way to make a playlist, because you have exactly what you want, expanding their entire collection, or like you said with the David Lee Roth years, just that one time period of a band. Oh yeah, those are great.
Yeah, and it's just, again, like you said, I totally agree, because these record companies would throw out these greatest hits, and yeah, there were some great songs on there because it is their greatest hits, but there was always like, oh, how come this song is not on? This is totally better than this song. And then it would inspire you to make like a tape of like side one, with 5 songs or 6 songs or whatever it was, and then you'd have side 2, and then on mixtapes you'd write your own liner notes on it and whatever. And at least I got that involved in it, and I really enjoyed, because it allowed you to be creative with someone else's music and allowed you to kind of make it your own, even though it wasn't.
Right. Yeah, I know. There were a couple of times making those and just, explaining why they're in the order and stuff. And it's only a justification to myself, but, sometimes it's stuff that I want to look back on.
Right. Or, there's been a couple albums that I've purchased over the years that I've always felt the sequencing was completely wrong. Like I'd be looking at the CD and be like, who chose the order of these songs? Like there's no, because really the purpose of sequencing is, it's like a plane. The album is like an airplane. You get in the airplane and you take off, and that's your intro. The first 2 songs is like your takeoff, and then you get into autopilot, and then you coast, and you want to keep that level throughout the album, and then you land at the end. So it's important that the sequencing is done right. And I guess it's a lost art now, because it really doesn't matter in a lot of cases, because EPs are now a lot more prevalent than they were. And with the CD now, you've got 14 songs, and, it doesn't matter what sequence they're in. You're going to listen to it. You're going to shuffle it. So it's really an afterthought a lot of times for many albums that are put out. But I just remember having that feeling, like, oh, I could do a better job than this. And then I would make my own CD with my sequence. And I always felt the album sounded better and was a better experience as a result of it. Did you ever do that?
Yeah. No, I've never done that. But I definitely know what you're talking about, where it just isn't right. And you can sense it, like you're halfway through and you're like, why, is this song here where it should have been, like the first track on the album. But yeah, I definitely know what you're talking about.
Nothing was worse than an album ending on a wrong note. It would be so unfulfilling for a music fan to be excited about an album, to put it in, the CD player in your car or the cassette, in your stereo at home, and be all into it. And then at the end, you're like, I really don't like, the way the songs were chosen. There's some really good songs on it. And then you just try to reshuffle them in your mind and try to figure out a better way. And yeah, it would almost be at the point where I get aggravated. I'm like, oh, how could they do this? This is completely crap, So it was so important. Sequencing is a lost art form. Definitely. It was huge back in the day. You don't really hear much about it. People really don't understand it. And a lot of times too, it's the same thing when you go to a concert. The sequencing of songs on a set list is again, the same type of airplane example, taking off and landing.
Right. Yeah, because you'll go to a concert and, the band has played the set, the encore is going to happen. And then sometimes after the concert, you're like, well, where were, song A, B, and C? Those should have been, in the set somewhere. And, at least in, your opinion, it would have made the concert so much better if those had been in the set list and at certain points throughout the set. And it just, it's frustrating.
When you talk or when you write on your blog about making mixtapes or burning CDs, and you relive this, right? I mean, you relive these memories. What's that process like in terms of writing, in terms of connecting with the past, your past, through music?
So I start off with re-listening to the CD, or if it's a newer thing, a playlist, and just kind of thinking back to that time. I have a spreadsheet that I keep that has all the playlist, the song, the artist, the month, and the year it was created. And so I know when it was from, and I'll usually grab a photo album and kind of flip through it just to kind of remember some other things that were going on at the time. And then I'll make a short list of, the things going on in my life that I want to hit on during the blog post. And then also, if possible, tie in, that to the music on the CD or playlist now, and show kind of where some of the inspiration came from, if there is some inspiration. There are definitely some throughout the ones I've talked about so far on the blog, where there's direct correlation between what was going on in my life and what songs are on a playlist. That's kind of the start. And then I just kind of, from that short list, fill in the details. For listeners who haven't been out there yet, it usually starts off with me going through that time period, and then at the bottom, talking about the playlist itself and the songs, either maybe some interesting items about the music or how I feel about it now. And then also I'll include a link to a Spotify playlist. That's the general way I do it.
It must be, an enjoyable experience too, to kind of have that outlet to write about memories, because that's essentially what you're doing. You're writing about the music and you're writing about memories. And what's really cool is that, when you do look back at some of the old playlists that you did and some of the burned CDs or mixtapes or whatever, you kind of see your growth as a person, kind of what you're listening to at that point in time, versus maybe a couple years prior or a couple years after. And for a music fan, I think that's so important, is, evolving to liking, new music, although still enjoying the music from your past. That's an interesting dynamic too in having this blog that you do. Yeah,
I look back at some of these and I'm very critical about what I put on some of them, and some I'm to go back to song sequence real quick. There are a couple. I think one is Weekend in Charleston, where it's got some great songs, but the sequence is just off. And so I'll criticize that now, and looking back, trying to remember, was I really listening to that much, or was this kind of a something that was thrown together at the last minute before going and visiting friends at a different college campus, or was this something I thought some more of? A lot of the early ones kind of start to, you'll see, I'll criticize them for being against rules that I have in my philosophy now, and I'll point those out. Having a song on more than one playlist, or having multiple songs by one artist on a playlist. When I get further along, because I'm only probably about a year into this, you'll see the evolution of the music on the playlist, how it starts to focus more on specific genres or that I was listening to at the time, and also on occasion what songs were popular, although I tend not to do that so much now.
Yeah, for me, thinking about my musical taste, I mean, obviously I started out rock and roll, hard rock, heavy metal. And as I got older, especially, during the 90s when you had the grunge movement replacing all those bands that, graced the screen at MTV, and then when that went away, because the grunge movement really wasn't around that long like,
Right.
80s rock was, if you consider, even though I consider 80s rock to be like in 3 different categories. But after that period, there really wasn't a lot of rock and roll. There really wasn't a lot of rock music. So there were bands like Counting Crows, or there were, artists like Ryan Adams, or as I mentioned, Pete Yorn, and a few others that kind of connected with me because I like the songwriting and the lyrics and the music, and they were writing about different things. And, I was in a different place mentally than I was, 10 years ago or when I was in high school. And I will always come back to my roots, which is hard rock and heavy metal. But having an appreciation for those other artists during that time was important. And, feeding into that need for new music and new rock music was also important too as well. As you grew, from high school or from middle school to high school to college to, professional life, did you notice a change in evolution of songs and type and style of music, as you move forward in your life?
Oh man, have I ever? Because thinking back, elementary school, middle school, it's what's popular, I guess, is what I listen to. Maybe a little pop country in there as well in middle school. And then it was almost like, not immediately when I got into high school, but probably around sophomore year, I bought the Black Album. And then I also got this, it was a CD of Extreme Championship Wrestling's intro music. And a lot of it was covers, metal songs by other metal and punk bands. Those two kind of got me into metal. And so for the rest of high school, it was all just Pantera, Sepultura, Soulfly, a little bit into the new metal. And then it was almost odd that I was in the National Guard, and so I went to basic training in October of 2001. And I met a guy there who was from New Jersey, and he'd grown up only on like hardcore punk. Like he talked about going to, hardcore shows where they're doing, mosh pit dances with like picking up the change and, windmills and stuff. And it was a metal mosh pits I'd been in, I'd never seen that in Chicago or when I'd seen them in St. Louis or Peoria. And so there's a whole different side of music where, hardcore is not terribly far from metal. And then from there, all the different shades of punk. And so I think when I got back from basic training and my advanced training, I got into more of the punk stuff. And from there, was into alt country Americana. There was some reggae I got into at some point. And then, nowadays, I listen to everything, but it still kind of is all shades of different types of punk, hardcore, post-hardcore, emo, just straight up skate punk. And then also the alt country Americana, stuff like Drive-By Truckers, Lucero, Jason Isbell. And then I still listen to metal sometimes, but yeah, man, you're really kind of looking back, see the evolution of yourself and what you're into.
Lucero is one of my favorite bands. I love seeing those guys live. Those guys are just incredible.
Yeah, I've probably seen them 5 times, I think. Last at Riot Fest last year.
I think the first time I saw them, it was either in Bloomington, Indiana, or it was at Otto's downstate. They were just was it Otto's is in what? Is it Champaign?
I know the Canopy Club is there. I don't know about Otto's, so.
No. I forget where the town is. It's been years since I've been there, but what about the name for the blog? How did you come up with that? I mean, was it just a basic name, or what the thought process was with it?
It's about playlists. I decided to just come with the moniker Playlister, and then I tried to see if Playlister.com was available. It wasn't. The people who owned it wanted like $32,000 for it, and there's no way I was paying that for something I'm not planning on to make any money off of. So Playlister playlisterblog.com was available for $13 from Google. So that's just the short of it.
Well, Mark, I thank you for doing the episode. You know, a great topic, one that I think music fans, rock fans forget about how it was growing up. And I appreciate the time, and I appreciate you coming on.
Oh, man, thanks so much for having me. I enjoy, the podcast so much. It's in my weekly rotation. I hit different ones each day, and I love it. I love that you have so much content, and it's coming out all the time.
Well, part of that is inspired because of the quarantine. I was just thinking, the other day, I'm like, man, when life gets back to somewhat normal, am I going to be able to maintain 5 episodes a week? So I think I may have set up a precedent for myself that I have to maintain, which I'm going to have to learn how to manage my time to do that. So it's, but no, I do enjoy doing it. And it's all about the content. It's all about subjects that people will listen to and find interesting. So I appreciate the kind remarks.
You're welcome.
Once again, everybody, that's Mark from playlisterblog.com. You can find him on Twitter at playlisterblog. Great episode, great conversation. Really enjoyed it. Once again, I'm Jay Scott. This is The Hook Rocks, the Ultimate Rock Community Podcast. Hope everyone's staying safe, staying healthy. We will talk again soon. Thank you.
Ah